How's it going, everybody? This is American History. I'm Mr. Wannen. Today's topic is the 1920s. Let's go ahead and get started. The 1920s looms large in the American conscience, and for a lot of good reasons. It's a time of huge change. We have brand new roles for women, new roles for African Americans. There's a new consumer culture that's going to develop. There is a discernible American unified identity that begins to take shape in the 1920s. And also in this decade, you have this grand moralistic experiment in the form of prohibition, in which these people are going to try to quite literally solve all of the world's problems. Now, prohibition is remembered today as a catastrophically bad idea, but we have the benefit of hindsight. In the 1920s, not so much. What they were trying to do is nothing less than to literally solve all of the world's problems. You just have to get rid of alcohol. Now, for most of American history, our country has a drinking problem. These people drank a lot, and it had all kinds of negative consequences. Spousal abuse was very prominent, in which drunken men would go home and abuse their children and their loved ones. With the check in hand, men would go to the saloon and spend the entire weekly wage, leaving women to try to find a way to deal with the financial shortcomings. How are you going to feed the children? How are you going to pay for the rent? The money has been drunk. Factory owners lamented the fact that if their workers had just shown up to work sober, then productivity could triple. The vast majority of the crimes committed in the United States was alcohol related, either people committing crimes because they were drunk or people committing crimes because they wanted to get drunk. In many ways, it was the early 19th century's version of methamphetamines or crack cocaine. Saloon owners and the brewers had this huge footprint in the American political system, and many times votes were actually exchanged for alcohol. If you could just somehow get rid of alcohol, then you could solve all these problems. You can solve domestic abuse, you can solve the workplace inefficiencies, you can eliminate all crime. If you get rid of alcohol, you could have nothing less than a perfect world. And that's what these people were shooting for. They were going to try to pass legislation to essentially ban this malignant aspect of American society. Now, what's really interesting is that if you look at the Constitution, the entire document is a list of rights and privileges. You get the right to assemble, you get the freedom of the press, you get the right to bear arms, the right to a speedy trial, and so on and so forth. There's only 2 occasions in the Constitution in which it tells you no. In the 13th Amendment, which says that you cannot have a slave, and in the 18th Amendment, which says that you cannot have an alcoholic drink. Prohibition was passed with the very best intent, but it's not going to manifest that way in society. It really does just backfire in every conceivable way. One of the weird things about prohibition is that if you want to make something desirable, make it illegal. In the same country that is going to make alcohol illegal, in the same year, we are going to become the #1 importer of cocktail shakers. They're not making smoothies with cocktail shakers. They're drinking. Now, let me go ahead and describe the process a little bit. So, a lot of times, this alcohol came from illegal moonshiners. Now, the name comes about by individuals who are working by the light of the moon to create this illegal alcohol. Now, I'm not going to go a lot into the details of how to make the alcohol because I don't want any strange or weird emails from your parents. Why did you teach Joe how to make illegal moonshine? So, I'm just going to show you this picture. Now, the moonshine is made and then it is carried to market by people known as bootleggers. And literally, people, I mean, it got the name because people would strap the alcohol to their leg and wear a long jacket. Bootleggers. So the bootleggers are the people that transport the illegal alcohol. Now, the illegal alcohol is going to be served in speakeasies. This is essentially like the world's worst kept secret. Everybody knows where the speakeasies are. You give a secret knock or a secret password, you go in, and it's essentially a giant party. Prohibition might have started with the very best intent, but man, it's not going to end that way. The problem is that you got an industry worth a lot of money. And before Prohibition, that money was in legal, private hands, which could be taxed by the government. In making this product illegal, they're going to illegalize the making of it, but not the demand. The demand is not going to diminish. People, by and large, who drank before Prohibition are still going to want to drink after Prohibition. A constitutional amendment is not going to alleviate that desire. So because there is a group of people who want to drink, there is going to be another group of people who are going to be willing to supply that demand. And since it's not going to be legal, now it's going to be illegal elements that are going to supply that demand. Prohibition is going to give rise to organized crime in America and create an entire institution of hypocrites. Now, the illegal alcohol is going to come from all different places. It's going to come from the United States with the moonshine. It's going to come from Canada. It's going to come from the Caribbean. It's going to come from Europe. It's going to be coming from people's own kitchens. People are going to make illegal moonshine in their bathtubs. Yeah, bathtub gin was a thing. You make the booze in the bathtub, not going to tell you how, and then you're going to go ahead and bottle it and sell it and make a bunch of money that way. It's only a matter of time, however, before criminal elements kind of begin to elbow into the racket here and begin to control the illegal booze market. And, you have Al Capone, for example, who is going to dominate the booze trade in Chicago and essentially acquire an industry worth millions and millions of dollars. And now he can use that money not only to get rich, but to buy soldiers, to buy police officers, to buy judges, to buy politicians. He's going to install governors. In one case, he got mad at a governor and kicked his butt down the stairs of his own Capitol building. So, yeah, Al Capone is going to run Chicago. And what you're going to develop is this gang warfare in the American streets over control of this incredibly profitable business. Now, for whatever reason, we are going to allow military-type weapons to be sold in America by average Americans. For example, the Thompson submachine gun, which was actually developed in World War I as a trench clearing weapon. You run across no man's land with this lightweight submachine gun, jump in a trench, and you don't got to worry about aiming. You're just going to pull the trigger and clear that trench. Well, it's not a war going on, at least not in Europe, but they're going to use that weapon on American streets, and the violence and the death count is just going to go through the roof. Now that was pretty confusing, so let's go ahead and see if we can simplify this with a classroom analogy. We're going to go ahead and pretend that there are these two gangs, and they are going to be fighting over Prohibition illegal alcohol. Now, our first gang is going to be led by Jerry L. But of course, he's going to need soldiers. So here we have Aiden, and of course, he does push-ups in the gym, so he's buff. Here's Cade. Here's Tyler. Here's David, and as you can see, he has a sword, and he just cut Tanish in half. And here we have Gang Supreme. Now, unfortunately, Jerry L. wasn't a very good leader, so they're going to get rid of him by pushing him off a cliff. Please note the deadly jagged rocks at the bottom. He's going to be replaced by Daniel. Now, our first gang was from the west side, so this new gang is from the south side, and they all live on Hamilton Street. This is Nisha. Here's Saryu. Here's Kennedy. Here is gang leader Naral. And of course, Muyao. And here you can see them all together. This is Gang Hamilton, and they are, of course, raising a glass of chocolate milk to freedom. Now, before Prohibition, there are ways to make money, gambling, for example, but it's not exactly profitable. And as a result, these gangs don't have a lot of money, and as a result, they're fairly weak. So the violence is significantly reduced. But after Prohibition, alcohol is now illegal, so they can move into the alcohol trade, and this is extraordinarily lucrative, so they can now get rich. Now, thanks to the very capable leadership of Naral, Gang Hamilton is going to use the money they got from illegal Prohibition, buy better weapons, and expand their empire by waging war on their competitors. Now, unfortunately, Daniel wasn't quite as thorough, and he decided to arm his soldiers with kazoos. Ironically, it was Jerry L. who suggested that they buy guns instead of kazoos, but they didn't listen to him. Meanwhile, with a complete monopoly of the illegal liquor trade, the Hamiltonians got rich. Prohibition had this corrosive element in American society which just bred hypocrisy. You know, you have this law that was openly disregarded by large numbers of people, including the very people who passed the legislation. So you have these politicians who voted to make alcohol illegal drinking openly. And the public just saw this hypocrisy from the top trickling down to the bottom, where the police officers were on the take, the judges were on the take, the politicians were on the take. And, you know, if you could openly break one law, well, why can't you openly break other laws? The crime rate in America is going to skyrocket because of this legislation. The fascinating thing about Prohibition is the fact that it actually allowed more people access to alcohol. Making something illegal tends to do that in a really weird way. If it's legal, it tends to be controlled by the government. But if it's illegal, then it is controlled by criminal elements, and they tend to only really be concerned with selling more of the illegal substance. So for alcohol, before Prohibition, women never drank, at least not openly in public. But after Prohibition, women are going to be celebrated drinking, and they're going to be able to go to speakeasies and drink alongside men. The strange thing about Prohibition is that it can be at the same time very complicated and also very simple. Now, you could make it complicated by going into all the reasons why it failed. It led to more people drinking. It dramatically increased crime. It was never properly funded, and as a result could never be feasibly enforced. But in reality, all those things were besides the point. Prohibition is going to fail because people wanted to drink. That is it. How bad do some of these people want to drink? About as bad as this dog wants that dollop of peanut butter. In 1933, the grand experiment will end with the passage of the 21st Amendment. Prohibition will be abolished.
Why are you doing that, Dad?
It's during the 1920s where we're going to get a sneak preview of what an affluent African American culture might look like in America. Now, the Harlem Renaissance has its roots in World War I, in which the enlistment of white soldiers is going to leave job opportunities for African Americans, and African Americans are going to flood into the cities to take some of these jobs. It's going to be segregated, but nevertheless, in places like Harlem, you are going to have this burgeoning African American community and this incredibly rich culture that's going to develop because of it. You have really this blossoming of arts in which you have Langston Hughes writing poetry, you have Louis Armstrong, and this creation of jazz that is going to become the soundtrack of America in the 1920s and 30s. You know, Prohibition might have been an unmitigated disaster with its increase in the number of people drinking, its increase in crime rates, its open disregard for the law, but it did have a couple positives here. One of the most interesting positives is the breaking down of racial stereotypes in this country. Not everything about Prohibition was negative. As men, and now women, flagrantly broke the law, they filled speakeasies to overflowing. To meet this new demand, establishments opened. New York alone had as many as 100,000 of them. With such a crowded marketplace, owners had to find a way to differentiate themselves from their competitors. Music could accomplish this task. The best jazz musicians in the world were black, and many of them lived in Harlem. And if you were white and you wanted to listen to the best music and go to the coolest clubs, you had to go where these African Americans played. During the 1920s, blacks and increasingly whites found themselves in the same room, listening to the same music. Here they will develop a commonality around music that will begin to uproot racial prejudices. Throughout our history, the image of African Americans in the media was almost exclusively negative. Then, all of a sudden, you have this. Musical genius, and perhaps the coolest man who ever lived, Duke Ellington. This imagery and new roles for African Americans began to challenge the racial norms. A challenge long time in coming, but far from concluding. During the 1920s, women are going to begin to explore newfound freedoms. They had just recently gained access to the voting booth and began to assert themselves politically. See the 18th Amendment. And they also began to challenge social and cultural norms. Increasingly, women began to move to the cities, and these newly liberated women were called flappers. Think short skirts, knees, and bobbed hair. They drank openly, smoked openly, flirted openly, and of course they danced the Charleston. By the way, extra credit if you learn to dance the Charleston. Now, it's important to remember that these new freedoms were not experienced by all women, or even most women, but it was a start. It's also worth remembering that this start was entirely responsible because of the Industrial Revolution and the freedom that it allowed people from the plow. Life before the Industrial Revolution was hard. Farmers typically started their day at 3:30. It took about 2 hours to milk 20 cows, and it had to be done before daylight because every hour of that daylight was needed. The work was done at night with kerosene lamps, which was of course a fire hazard, and if that barn accidentally caught fire, your family was ruined. Before the day got started, livestock needed to be taken care of. The watering needed to be done by hand. The hay had to be stored up in the barn, then stomped so that it was soft enough for the cows to eat. The food had to be prepared by hand. That meant that hundreds of ears of corn needed to be ground by hand by the corn sheller. The actual field work was extraordinarily difficult. Cotton was known as a man killer because much of that work had to be done on the knees. The work took all day, and the day ended exactly where it began, with the farmer stumbling around in the dark in the barn milking those cows. Yet no matter how bad that man had it, the woman had it substantially worse. Now you think about a farm and most people think of those windmills that they see in the back, but those windmills were expensive, about $400 in today's money, and most farmers could not afford that. As a result, their source of water was either a stream or a well. If the source of water was a stream, that meant that the house had to be far enough away so that it was not destroyed if there was occasional floods. That meant long walks. Most, however, had a well. The wells typically, on average, were about 100 feet deep. Very few women had the strength to lift these buckets of water with just their hands. Instead, it required their entire bodies to be used. An average person used 4 gallons of water a day. The average family had 5 people. The average family as a whole used 200 gallons, or 4/5 of a ton every day. That's 73,000 gallons of water, or 300 tons in a year. On average, the well was located 250 feet from the barn. To do this work, the wife would have to walk 1,750 miles on average, and it would take up 63 entire days of the year, every year. One woman joked that she had running water. It was her running with a bucket of water. Water buckets held 4 gallons and weighed 32 pounds each, a 64-pound trip. The water was used from washing, cooking, cleaning. It was needed every day. After the water was gathered, the stove had to be lit. They were dirty. The black soot escaped into the house. The stove could not be left unattended. And worst of all, they were hot. Now, it was nice during the winter, but during summer, which could last up to 5 months in many parts of the country, it was extraordinarily bad. No matter how hot the day was, the stove had to be lit, and not just for cooking, but also for baking. Bread took all day to make. In summer, during harvest time, up to 30 men would be working in the field. All of them eat 3 meals a day, and all of them would be cooked by that woman. Canning food was necessary for the family's very survival. The fruits and vegetables that were canned during the summer would carry them through all winter. It needed to be done the same day the food became ripe. And during summer, something was always coming ripe. Peaches, strawberries, blueberries, tomatoes, okra, zucchini, corn. The canning required constant attention. The fire required constant attention. The pot must be stirred constantly. Peaches took about an hour per load. And every time that heat died down, you had to make it hot again. There was no rest. If the peaches came ripe, that was the day you canned. You cannot can rotten food. If you were sick, you had to can. If you were pregnant, you had to can. When it was time to can, you canned, trapped between a blazing hot sun and a hot fire. Monday was laundry day. Every week all year long, every week without fail was wash day. You filled 3 large zinc tubs and a dish pad The clothing was scrubbed in the first tub, then placed in boiling water. The clothes needed to be stirred and pressed and punched. After about 15 minutes of work, clothing needed to be held out on a stick so that the dirty water could drain, and then placed in the rinse tub. After rinsing out the clothes, they were placed in the third tub, which was the bluing tub. After the bluing, the clothing was placed in a dishpan, which was filled with starch. 8 loads a week. After each load, the water needed to be changed. Each tub held 8 gallons. Part of the wash day required walking to get the water. The water also needed to be warmed, which required wood, the oven, and fire. One woman stated standing above that fire in the boiling water, punching those clothes made you feel like you were being roasted alive. Clothes needed to be wringed out after every tub. By the end of the day, your hands would be rubbed raw. Stooping over those tubs hurt the back. One woman explained, "One thing I'll never forget how much my back hurt on wash day." Tuesday was ironing. For many, that was the worst job. These irons needed to be heated on the stove. They only kept their heat for a few minutes. A man's shirt may require as many as 2 irons. 3 or 4 irons would be kept in circulation. Irons sitting on a burning stove attracted soot. Thus, they needed to be cleaned with a rag dipped in salt or sanded and scraped. No matter how much you checked, there would always be dirt that would ruin the clothes and then needed to be washed again. Burns were common. Burn and blistered hands that needed to handle the rags and the salt. It took all day. Women filled their days with helping in the field, and at night they sewed. The job wore them out. One woman explained, "I saw my mother worn down to a nub, old before her time, and I swore to God that would never happen to me. Then I got married, and I had kids. And I remember the first time I did laundry, I knew that it would happen to me." It was the electrification of America and the invention of the washing machine and the sewing machine that ultimately freed women from this type of life. No wonder they danced the Charleston. During the 1920s, we're going to develop what we basically consider American identity. Now, if you think about what makes a nation, it's not just lines on a map. I mean, look at the Austro-Hungarian Empire. That was not a nation. Instead, as best as we can get to it, what we consider a nation is essentially an imagined community. It's a collection of people who strongly feel that they have a connection for whatever particular reason. This has been pretty tricky for our country because we don't have a lot of the things that Europe has going for it. You know, Europe has this shared history going back thousands of years, shared culture, shared language, shared religion. The United States is a collection of immigrants for the most part. So in order to develop a national identity, we essentially need something in common. We need something that we all can basically appreciate, something that we can all stand behind. And in the 1920s, it's a mass consumer culture. That's what's going to develop. With the advent of new advertising and the radio, we are going to get large collections of people who would never associate with each other something finally in common. You have those insular communities. Think of New York, right? You have Chinatown, you have the Lithuanian neighborhood, the Italian and the Irish neighborhood, right? And the Protestant Anglo-Saxon WASP. So you need to give all those people, right, the Italians, the Irish, the Jews, the Protestants, all something in common. And this mass consumer culture is what's going to do it early on. And you're going to look at the same advertisements. I mean, if you're a woman, you want that vacuum cleaner. You want that washer. By the way they sold vacuum cleaners was absolutely brilliant. It was door-to-door salesman, and the guy would knock on the door, and the woman would open it, and he would have a handful of dirt, and he would throw it into the house. Now, before a vacuum, in order to clean that house, you needed to remove all the furniture from the room, roll up that carpet, drag that carpet outside, hang that giant carpet up on a clothes hanger, and then beat it with what looks like essentially a tennis racket. It was hard work. So the fact that this guy came to the door and threw dirt in the floor, right, that's a lot of work that he just caused this poor woman. Except now he goes ahead and plugs this thing into the wall socket, newly electrified, and within the matter of a couple minutes, the entire room is clean. What would have been an entire day was done in just a couple minutes. Whether you are Irish, Italian, or Protestant, you want that vacuum cleaner. You want that washing machine. So this collection of amazing electrical machines is going to be desirable by everybody, and that's where we get this, American consumerism. One of the very first things that we all could have legitimately in common is the fact that we wanted these objects. I don't think there's a thing that really kind of knitted this country together more than the radio, though. How you build these bonds is to create commonality. And for these groups that would never associate with each other, having that radio connect them all is just of immense importance, right? No matter who you were, no matter what your language, no matter what your skin looked like, these people are going to be sitting in front of that radio and they're going to be listening to the same programs. They're going to be laughing at the same jokes. They're all going to have this commonality for the very first time, and that's really kind of what builds up this American identity. And we love Hollywood, but there's a reason for it, right? It comes about at this golden age when we were all beginning to be knit together culturally by Hollywood. You think about New York, and you have all these different groups of people, but they're listening to the radio and they're rooting for the Yankees. And they're listening to Babe Ruth hit those home runs, and it stops mattering. Slowly but surely, it stops mattering what you look like and what your religion is, because if you're in New York, you follow the Yankees. You root for the Yankees, and you root against Boston. That's what you do if you're in New York. And of course, if you're in Boston, then you do the same thing. So these sports teams begin to knit these communities together, and it's the radio that allows them to do it. No wonder why baseball is America's pastime. Baseball develops at this very crucial period where Americans were beginning to find their collective identity, who they were as a people. They're going to have the same heroes. They're all going to listen with bated breath as Charles Lindbergh flies solo across the Atlantic, the very first human to do it. By the way, take a look at that airplane. There's no front windows. If that guy wanted to see what was happening in the front of that airplane, he needed to lean his elbow out the side window and kind of do one of these things. Right? Otherwise, he's just flying with instruments or basically blind. Took him over 24 hours to do it. When he landed in Europe, he was the most famous person in the world. And now, no matter who you were, Charles Lindbergh was the hero. Amelia Earhart, first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic. She actually tried to fly across the world, died in the Pacific, however. It's tragic. But again, that tragedy stitched the country together. Hollywood was incredibly important at this time period. And again, just bridging that divide, giving these people something in common. They're all going to go to these palaces, these movie palaces that can seat 5,000 people, live orchestra, ornate Art Deco decorations, and they're going to laugh at Charlie Chaplin, and it gives them all something in common again. This American identity begins to be formed in the 1920s, and it really still carries through. We love Hollywood, we love sports, we love baseball, we love buying things. American. Speaking of buying things, the American economy in the 1920s is going to be booming, and it booms for a couple reasons. They're going to develop buying on credit. Is there anything more American than basically putting something on a credit card? So that develops in the 1920s. It's not necessarily a credit card, but it's the same thing, more or less. It's an installment plan. Hey, you want that washing machine. You want indoor plumbing. You want a vacuum. You want a radio. You want central heating. You want electrical lights, but you can't pay for it. Charge it. A little bit of money down, pay later. And these people are going to begin to buy on installment all kinds of amazing things. And why wouldn't you want flushing toilets? You gotta go to an outhouse in the backyard? Not American. Put it on credit. In many ways, though, the 1920s economy booms because of the automobile. Yeah, the automobile, American, there you go, right there. That's what we are, all right? We love cars. We like that individual sense of freedom, the wide open roads, and that all develops in the 1920s. And it's driven by and large by Henry Ford. He is going to find a way to build a car cheaply. And that involves a brand new means of production. Now, he got this idea by visiting pigs, animals being slaughtered in Chicago. And what he saw is an animal coming into that slaughter facility, and it left in pieces. And it was butchered along a moving assembly line. And Henry Ford thought, well, if you can disassemble an animal, I bet you can assemble a car. So he is going to put these cars on a moving assembly line, and slowly but surely, over the course of, over a mile, and a factory that was called the Crystal Palace because of all the windows that it had, that car is going to be built from a bolt to a nut to a door to a chassis to four wheels to it rolling out of the factory in just a couple hours. He's going to make millions of these things and ultimately drive down the price of a car to under $200 in 1920s money. That's a couple $1,000s today. In other words, it's a reasonable car. Now, working in this factory was, it was not an easy job. It's boring. You stand there at your post and you're doing one job all day long. Your job is to buff that front left door. That's it. You're buffing that front left door, not the back door, all right? Just that door, front left. And that's what you do all day long. And as a result, turnover was pretty high. Nobody wants to do that all day, all week, all month, all year. In order to hold on to these employees because, it costs a lot of money to train them and hire them, Henry Ford decided to do something radical. Now, the workday on average was 10 hours. He's going to slash that to 8 hours. And the average pay for a worker was $2.50 a day. He's going to double that to $5. It created a bonanza. I mean, this was just a bolt of lightning. Everybody now wanted to work for $4 to $5 a day, a shorter day for $5. All right? Who didn't want to do that? And even more importantly, it gave the workers at Ford the financial stability to buy a Ford automobile. So he's going to be now selling more cars. In other words, Henry Ford is going to be making money all over the place here. Now, let me go ahead and talk first about the economy, and then I'll talk about how the car changed American culture. This industry, it's a big industry. And obviously, Henry Ford is going to be making a lot of money. But really what's important here is all the other industries that are related to cars. In order for Ford to make a car, he needs rubber. So if you're in the rubber industry, this is a gold mine that Ford's selling all these cars, because now you can sell even more rubber, so you can hire more employees. And of course, if you hire more employees, then they can buy a car too. The more cars that are being built means the more black paint that you need, and the more glass that you need, and the more oil that needs to be refined. All these bridges that now have to be built, and these new homes, and these new roads. So that car is going to create its own economy that is going to branch out across the United States. You may be in construction, but you got a job because Henry Ford is building these cars, because it's going to be spiking demand for houses. Because if you have a car, you don't have to live in the middle of the city anymore. Dirty, crowded, polluted. Now you can go ahead and live in the suburbs, all right? So that construction worker can build a house, and the other one can build the road, and they can buy an automobile. So you have this circular economy that is just going up and up and up. For a lot of people, they're going to be living really, really well. Economists call this a boom economy, right? People purchase more goods, companies earn a higher profit, companies expand and hire more people have more income, so they purchase more goods, and it just keeps on cycling over and over and over again. And it can cycle at an accelerated rate. Now, all these new cars are going to change American culture. Man, you can't have a drive-through if you don't drive. Right? Nobody's going to be walking through McDonald's. It's not a walk-through, it's a drive-through. You got to have a car. What's the point of having a motel if you don't have a car? The Sunday drive. You can't have a Sunday drive without a car. It changes things. It changes where people live. They can now live in a city. They can now live in a suburb instead of living in the city center. It changes the economy. It changes where people live. It changes the leisure patterns, you know. The Sunday drive is developed. Vacations, road trips are all affected. One of my favorite ways that the car changed culture, though, is it changed the way people dated. It changed courtship patterns. Now, you think about how dating transpired before the car, in which, you know, if you were a young man and you liked that girl, you wanted to ask her out, you had to walk to her parents' house. You had to knock on that door. Her father would answer the door. Her father would invite you in, sit you down in the parlor, have a nice awkward silence. And then when you thought the date was over, and maybe you waved hi at her, you left. And that was dating. Or you can ride up on that car, honk the horn, she can come running out of the house, and out you go. It changes things. By the way, the older people called the car the devil's buggy. Ask your health teacher. You know, everything was great in the 1920s. You have this booming economy. Everybody's got a car. You have a rapidly increasing middle class who has access to all these amazing inventions, newly electrified vacuums and washing machines. You have these new roles for African Americans and women, a new unified American identity. Clearly, nothing bad is ever going to happen again. Thanks for watching. I'm Mr. Wannen. Our next episode is going to be the 1930s, where apparently something bad's going to happen. Take care.
I told you last night there's so much insecurity.